Thanks for that intro and welcome everybody. Can you hear me okay? How about now? Good still? Okay, great. So I'm Rizwan Virk. Everyone calls me Riz, so feel free to do that. I learned recently that all the high school kids are using the term Riz. I learned it from a barista at Barnes and Noble, which he said, my younger brother in high school uses Riz all the time. I had no idea what it meant. So anyway, quick background on myself. I went to MIT, studied computer science many, many years ago. And then I moved out to Silicon Valley and went to Stanford Business School and became an entrepreneur and started a series of video game companies. We had the number one game in the App Store many years ago now. And then I ended up selling those and becoming a venture capitalist. And I'll talk about how that relates to my talk today. And the subject today is the simulation hypothesis and the world's religions, AI, NPCs, and scripture. So let me start with how this particular talk came about, which is that a few years ago, I wrote a book called The Simulation Hypothesis. Some of you may have heard of it. And there's actually a second edition of that book coming out this summer from Penguin Random House. But here at the conference is the last chance to buy the first edition and get it signed. So if you're interested, afterwards, I'll be doing a book signing over in the speakers table. But so I wrote this book about computer technology, about quantum physics, about unexplained phenomena, like we talk about here at Contact in the Desert, as well as traditional religions. And what happened after that was a little unexpected. I got an email from HarperCollins India. And they said, have you heard of Autobiography of a Yogi? How many of you know Autobiography of a Yogi? Quite a few. So Swami Yogananda was one of the first Hindu swamis to come over and live in the US. And it was about 100 years ago, in 1920, that he came over. And his book was instrumental in getting the entire 60s, 70s counterculture, hippie movement to be interested in Eastern philosophy. And they said, it's the 75th anniversary of Autobiography of a Yogi, and we want you to write a book for Indians about how this might apply to the modern world. And I said, are you sure you want me to write this book? I'm a technologist. I'm a scientist. I like Yogananda. I quote him in my books, but I'm not a Hindu Swami. And they said, no, we want you to write it because we want you to talk about how modern technology compares with these ancient teachings. And so I ended up writing that book. It's called Wisdom of a Yogi. And then I got another strange invitation. This was from the Al-Mahdi Institute in Birmingham in the UK. They're a Shiite Islamic, academic study group. And they said, we're having a conference and we'd like you to come and talk about it. I said, really? I mean, yeah, I grew up in a Muslim family, so I knew a little bit about Islam, but the conference was about Islamic jurisprudence. And, when is the beginning of life? When can you do abortion and the fetus? The same kind of stuff we're talking about here today. And I said, are you sure you want me to talk at this conference? It was like academics who study Islamic scholars. And there was an Ayatollah from Iran there as well. And so I gave them a talk about Islam and the simulation hypothesis. And it actually went reasonably well. And what I found was that there were pieces of scripture from Hinduism, from Buddhism, from Christianity and Judaism and Islam that all were implying something about the nature of reality. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the other way that this talk came about was that if you think of all the religions, they were founded either through like a theophany, where the divine makes an intervention in the physical world. It's a revelation that happens, like the Prophet Muhammad was in a cave and the angel Gabriel shows up and grabs him by the head and says, repeat after me. Or you have mystics or yogis who are meditating and they make observations about the world beyond, or perhaps they're doing DMT, which we were talking about in our earlier discussion. But the point is that it's either a revelation or an observation, and then they come back and they have to explain what they saw to regular people. So how are they going to explain something that is essentially ineffable, right? The nature of reality, to regular people? So what do? They come up with metaphors. And so pretty much all the scriptures are full of metaphors. But which metaphors did they use? Metaphors that would make sense 1,600 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, 5,000 years ago, right? So they wouldn't use technology metaphors from today, but they used the technology of the time. And so turns out all the religious scriptures use metaphors which might need to be updated today. And so that's what brings us to the simulation hypothesis. Most of you have probably heard this term by now. Anyone here not heard of the term, the simulation hypothesis? Okay, one or two. So basically, the simulation hypothesis is the idea that what we think of as physical reality is actually not real, that it consists of information. And then that information gets rendered for us to look as if it's real and if it's physical. And so even though this is a modern incarnation based on computer technology, it has its roots going back to science fiction. If any of you were at the panel earlier, you heard me quoting Philip K. Dick. From 1977, he said, "We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variables change." And if you watch that video and you look at the audience, everyone's like, "What?" You can see their faces like, this guy is crazy. He's done too many drugs or something. In the 70s, he was talking about computer simulation. But of course, the most popular version of this idea is the movie The Matrix. I'm sure most of you have seen The Matrix, right? And so that idea is where it took hold. And basically that the world is a kind of a video game, that information gets rendered for us just like in a video game. Like in a video game, and there really aren't any trees. If you think about it, they're just bits of information, but they get rendered in such a way that it looks like a road, it looks like trees, etc. And so that is partly what got me into the simulation hypothesis. What also got me into it was that I was making video games. And so a number of years ago, I went and put on a virtual reality headset. I had sold my last game company, and I was visiting another startup that was in Marin County, which is right across the bay from San Francisco. It's a beautiful view of the bay and the skyline of San Francisco. But instead of admiring that, they put this VR helmet, virtual reality helmet on me. And it was big. I mean, there was no mistaking that I was inside a game. And what happened is I started to play ping pong. And the responsiveness of the game was so good, the physics engine was so good, that for a moment at the end, I forgot that it was a game. My body tried to put the paddle on the table, and I tried to lean against the table. But of course, there was no table. The controller fell to the floor, and then I began to think, like, how long will it be before we can create something like the Matrix, which is so immersive that once you're inside of it, you would forget that there was a world outside of it. Now, you can look at the screenshot and see the graphics were terrible, right? And this virtual reality headset was really big. It was we used to joke in Silicon Valley and call it a toaster on your face. So there's no mistaking that you're in virtual reality, but even so, my body forgot. And so I defined this point called a simulation point, which is when we can reach the point where virtual is indistinguishable from physical reality, and the AI characters inside the game are indistinguishable from other humans controlling those characters. And so that's kind of what got me down the rabbit hole. And then turns out there was a guy named Nick Bostrom at Oxford, and he came up with what's called the simulation argument. And basically he said that, look, if anybody ever reaches that point, they would create lots of simulations, and we might be inside one of those simulations. And what are the odds that we're in one of those, let's say, million simulations versus only one base reality? And so that became known as the simulation argument. Here we can watch Elon Musk explain a little bit of it.
I think I remember that the strongest argument for us doing a simulation is probably doing a simulation. I think it's the following. That 40 years ago, we had Pong, like two rectangles and a dot. That is what games were. Now, 40 years later, we have photorealistic 3D simulations of money people playing simultaneously and same battle every year. And so we'll have virtual reality or augmented reality. If you assume any rates of improvement at all, then the data will become indistinguishable from reality. Just in very simple. Even if that advancement drops by 1,000 from what it is right now, then you just have to, let's imagine it says 10,000 into the future, which is nothing again, evolutionary scale. So suggesting that we're clearly on a trajectory to have games that are indistinguishable from reality, and those games to be played on any set-top box or on a PC or whatever, and then we could probably be, billions of such the computers to set up functions seem to follow that the answer in which reality is one of those. So I'm going to follow that up with this energy. Yeah.
Okay, so he was basically making, and you may have heard this online where he says the chances that we're not in a simulation is 1 in millions. Now, when most academics talk about the simulation hypothesis and most scientists talk about it, they're talking about that version. In that version, it's called an ancestor simulation, where we would basically create a simulation of, say, ancient Rome or of ancient India. But turns out that there's different versions of the simulation hypothesis. And these I call the NPC version versus the RPG version. And the one that tends to apply more closely to the religious scripture, which is my topic for today, is the RPG version. So NPC stands for, first of all, who knows what NPC stands for? Quite a few, actually. So it stands for non-player character, which are all the characters in the game that are not your character and that are not controlled by humans. So the term avatar, which of course comes from the ancient Sanskrit, which meant divinity coming down to earth, is your character inside the video game. And if there's a bartender, there's a guy that's just shooting arrows at you, there's like random people in the countryside, those are all NPCs because they're AI. On the other hand, the RPG version says that we are actually players of this game and we exist outside of the game and we have a character or an avatar inside the game. And so what you're seeing is my avatar, right? You're not seeing the true version of me. You're seeing the character that I happen to be playing at the current moment. And so I use the pictures from the Matrix there because in the Matrix, Neo, Morpheus, Trinity, they all existed outside the simulation. They also had characters inside the simulation. But turns out this is not a mutually exclusive thing. Inside a video game, you can have NPCs and you can have player characters or avatars, right? So it's more like a continuum that you can go from. And that raises all kinds of interesting questions about free will, agency, the nature of the universe. Are we real? And so what I'm going to talk about today is more of the RPG version. But is that too loud, by the way? No? Okay, cool. So before that, though, people say there's no way I could be in a simulation because this is all too real, right? And so there's a new version of the simulation hypothesis that's come out recently called the prompt hypothesis. And Google just released literally 2 weeks ago a video engine that can create AI characters that seem kind of real. And just like people, when they first hear about the simulation hypothesis, their reactions are here. Let's watch a short video and then we'll jump into the religious stuff.
Girl told me we're making prompts. Like, seriously, dude. You're saying all the things that are getting $1 billion for some random test.
Honestly, the biggest red flag is when the guy believes in the prompt theory. Like, really? We can't go prompts. Wake up, man.
You want to convince me that the perfect creation behind me is the result of ones and zeros? A binary code and nothing more? It makes no sense.
Imagine you're in the middle of a nice date with a handsome man, then he brings up the prompt theory. Yuck.
There's light coming from a quasar that's 1 billion light years away. So how long would it take for the light to reach us? 1 billion years, right? Because it's 1 billion light years away. And suppose